Hello and welcome to another edition of The Buck Stops Here. I'm Catherine Murray. The goal of my program is to provide informed, fact-based discussions about the matters that impact Canadian businesses, both large and small, the markets, and your money. Before we get to our guest today, just a quick market recap. Markets continue to grind higher, supported by accommodative monetary policy and a variant that is not derailing equities, likely because even though hospitalizations are increasing, it is really only in areas with low vaccination rates, meaning that investors recognize getting vaccinated can curb severe illness, which lends itself to the economic reopening trade. And therefore, the path of least resistance is for higher equity prices. Now, what's been working in the market lately? Think mega cap tech, FANG, and consumer discretionary. With that said, I'm thrilled to bring in our guest today to talk about what themes will impact our prospects here in Canada as we head to the polls. Calin Rovenescu is the former president and CEO of Air Canada, broadly credited with having saved Air Canada from bankruptcy and also expanding it dramatically to create a global brand. Welcome, Calin. Thank you so much for being with us to share your views and themes that you think are so important to Canadians.
Good morning, Catherine. It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And why don't we first start with that? I mean, you really did create a Canadian-based company, but built it into a global brand. So the question, of course, is for anybody who's having a small company right now, trying to build a small company and or a big company and really make it on the global stage. The question, of course, is Canada conducive to building a global brand? What do you say to that?
Well, this is, it starts with a great amount of ambition, from the individual entrepreneurs, whether they're small, medium, or large businesses. I think what we showed is that you can have the ambition to be amongst the best in the world. And when you're amongst the best in the world, you get that global champion, banner that comes along with it. However, you have to have the backdrop and the environment in the country that is conducive to building global champions, not tearing them down. And I think that this is one of the things that I've repeated several times over the last decade or so, is that as we've been on our path towards building a global champion, it hasn't always been with great support of our government, or governments, plural, provinces or federal government. There is this natural tendency, I would say, and it's come about over the last, call it 20 years, to bash business. And I think that for companies to go out of their comfort zone, to get out of their countries, to be able to build things that are sustainable on a global basis, it does require a great level of partnership with the government that you are residing in. And I think that this has been one of the challenges. And I'm hopeful that as we move forward, as we talk about building a better environment here in Canada, we'll also recognize the importance of nurturing, supporting, and encouraging global champions, because, of course, they are enormous contributors to the overall economy.
And Calin, I'd love for you to share a story that you've shared with me with respect to, what happens to the individual when people do bash business. I mean, you have had ticket agents saying, thank you very much for helping to build a great business. Maybe share that story so that we understand that we are all interconnected here in this ecosystem.
No, absolutely. Look, this is one of those. This is one of the great themes that when people stop and think about it, businesses are the largest creators of employment. Businesses are the largest creators of prosperity and wealth. Stock markets, pension funds, these are all things that are funded as a result of the private sector. And so, the story that I shared with you is, we had several of our employees who came up to me over the course of the decade and saying, I believed in what we were doing. I held on to my shares, and now I bought a cottage as a result of the money I made on those shares, or I was able to fund my kids' university as a result of having done well with my shares on Air Canada, for example. And of course, this exists throughout the entire ecosystem. So when people talk about the corporate excesses, and of course there are some, and there are some bad stories, as there are in many other parts of the economy. There are bad stories where some companies have gone astray. But generally, I think this is one of the things that has been shown, especially during the pandemic, is that a lot of large companies took care of their employees when things were good and when things were bad as well.
And, we appreciate that story because, it's great to be in a corporation that has a good corporate culture. And, for somebody to be able to buy a cottage or send their children to more sports programs, is so key and critical, I believe. And to point out, your shares were up 4,000% over a decade with you at the helm. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with Calin Rovenescu. And we are back with Calin Rovenescu, former president and CEO of Air Canada. Calin, as we think about heading to the polls right now and we look at government and perhaps quite frankly, the size of government seems to be getting bigger and bigger. An important aspect then of having a larger government is how are they managing it? How are they planning? How are they managing the country and our affairs? And, we can take a look at the pandemic. I'm curious as to how you believe the federal government has handled the pandemic. What score would you give them?
Well, so, first of all, in terms of the pandemic, and I appreciate as complicated as an environment as this has been, it caught everyone by surprise. Everyone was caught somewhat flat-footed by it. And I've said previously, my view of the overall handling of the pandemic, from the beginning to the end, is I would not have rated our performance at better than a 4 or a 5 out of 10. Now, the reason I say that, of course, we've done very well in the last several months in terms of the relative level of vaccinations, but we started off really, really slowly. And we started off somewhat confused at the beginning as to what we were trying to achieve. We hoped as a country that people would listen, and we hoped as a country that everyone would want to do the same thing. But of course, that's not realistic. And as I think we've learned in business, hope is not a particularly strong planning strategy. So I think, I felt that the country was not adequately prepared for this. Now, many other countries also were not adequately prepared. So this is not a particular unique criticism of Canada. But I felt that, I looked at the relationship that Canada had with the pharmaceutical industry and how so many, of the large pharmas had been alienated in terms of what had gone on in the previous period of time. I look at the funding and the structure of PHAC, the Public Health Agency of Canada. I looked at some of the early statements of the Public Health Agency of Canada when they were trying to tell us that the risk level was low. In the early days, when we were trying to limit flights to China, they were saying we should not have limitations on flights. And then later on, when we felt it was time to start opening up and working in partnership, it sort of seemed to always be, several steps in a disjointed fashion. And this comes back to, a planned economy, which, the ultimate planned economies are in places like China. And of course, I don't think that that's anything that we want for us. The way I would view this is that in order for business to have had its proper place here, it had to have been a key partner at the table in terms of the planning of how to deal with this, both in terms of the closures, in terms of the openings, in terms of the safety measures. One of the great things that I'm very proud of, which is outside of what we did at Air Canada, was a fantastic initiative that had been started by the Creative Destruction Labs. And this was to develop a system of rapid testing that would encourage and enable businesses to remain open by testing frequently. And this was a private sector initiative. We had some phenomenal participants and partners in that. But it took a private sector initiative to do that as opposed to a partnership with government. And so that's also where I think we can aspire to do much better. I look at countries that have true partnerships with business, smaller countries like Singapore, like Israel, like the UAE, that are able to build true partnerships. And then, we look at different countries of the G7 that have also fared somewhat better than we did.
Calin, the current Liberal government, of course, we're in an election time period right now, but they do believe, or at least they say that they do have partnerships with businesses. And at the same time, too, I've certainly talked to many private businesses and business leaders that say they can't even get a call back. So what do you say to that?
Well, look, I think every industry has got its own challenges. And we look at, the banking industry is a great example. The banks stepped up early on and helped, deliver funds and programs and loans to people who needed to try to keep afloat during the early stages of the pandemic. But when I'm talking about partnerships, I'm talking about true partnerships. I'm talking about having a discussion as to what do we do together meaningfully. We also had the government established a economic recovery task force that made very, very detailed recommendations. It had a phenomenal panel, including Monique Leroux as the chair, a really strong person. But I haven't really seen any response following that. I haven't seen any action as a result of it. So, the idea is I think we're at the stage where we should not be simply paying lip service to this notion of public-private partnership, government and private sector working hand in hand. This Creative Destruction Labs initiative on rapid testing is a good example where it can work, but the initiative arose from the private sector.
Fair point. And of course, the private sector also is the group that really creates the jobs. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail. And we are back with Calin Rovenescu, former president and CEO of Air Canada. Calin, we mentioned it at the top of the show, just talking about jobs and really who creates jobs, that being the private sector. But, during this election time period, you've got people on the campaign trail saying we, meaning the government, has created all these jobs. Exactly what do you say to that?
Well, look, I'm hearing some phenomenal, promises from all of the parties as to, million jobs being created. And again, I'm not, this is not a political statement for any particular party here, but I sort of chuckle at the idea that governments are going to create 1 million jobs here or 1 million jobs there. I believe that very strongly that it is the private sector that has created virtually all of the jobs. Yes, there are some public sector jobs that are there to support, the collection of taxes and the regulatory regimes that support the private sector. But at the end of the day, it's going to take the private sector to create these jobs. And I think that, what that means is that we need to have a regulatory environment that is conducive to that. We have a series of international, trade barriers that exist with requirements from other countries, but we have a series of non-trade barriers, such as regulatory structures that prevent, growth. And so this is an area how, the government's role in this 1 million job creation is ensure we have a conducive regulatory environment that contributes to people wanting to create jobs, be they in the small, medium, or large enterprise space. When you look further beyond that and you say, okay, well, are we attracting foreign investment? Well, what does it take to attract foreign investment? Do you have a foreign investment structure, review structure that is clear, that is fair, that is level playing field? These are the kind of drivers that will encourage companies to invest to create employment. When in the Air Canada context, if we bought an airplane, or when we bought the C-Series that became the A220 from Bombardier, that decision for us to buy that airplane, which was a $5 billion kind of a decision, led to the mass creation or mass protection of jobs in the people who were manufacturing those airplanes. And by manufacturing those airplanes, of course, it's all the suppliers that are part of the supply chain that is feeding that, and it goes on and on. So it's this, virtuous circle. Mm-hmm. And I'd say one of the biggest concerns that I currently have is what exactly happens post all of these programs that were put in during the pandemic, CERB and Qs and so on, which are problematic at many different levels.
And Calin, I'm curious as well, how concerned are you today versus perhaps 5 years ago with respect to the environment that would or would not be conducive to creating jobs when you think about the regulatory environment and what have you? Are you more worried today, and obviously being a business person in the investment banking world first and Air Canada, I think we are optimists at heart, but we're also realists. So give us your sense in terms of, because I think as long as people have a job, they think everything's okay. But we want to be concerned as well or aware of what happens tomorrow.
No, exactly. Well, I think I just alluded to this business with the various programs that had been put in place at the beginning of the pandemic, which were absolutely essential. And I want to, actually underscore that. It was important that people didn't fear from one day to the next as to whether they would lose their businesses, and that was necessary then. What we now have, or their jobs, or be able to feed their families. What we now have, 18 months into the pandemic, with many of these programs having remained, is that Many people have not returned to the jobs that they were doing previously, be they in the hospitality industry, in the tourism industry, in airlines, groomers in airlines or ticket agents. Many people have decided, I'm not doing that. And that will result in some businesses being permanently lost. And so it's not as simple as saying, well, now we're going to do away with those programs and hallelujah, everyone's going to come back to work. It's not going to be like that. The world is shifting, and we've seen the impact of electronic commerce, of the gig economy. You've got these other factors that are at work here. So I think the idea of creating jobs that will create manufacturing opportunities, supply chain opportunities, becomes a much trickier question. Landscapers can't get people to come in and do landscaping work. This is something that is across the economy, and I think we found this odd consequence where people have saved their money, and therefore the performance of banks has been better throughout this piece because but that is an artificial boosting of the economy. The government taking money, handing it to somebody taking that money, putting it in their bank account. That's not driving the economy.
Okay, we will take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll get a little bit more detail on your economic outlook. We'll be right back. Calin, you did say in the previous segment that you are concerned about the economic conundrum that we are in. So we have to be creative, as you say, to really make sure that we continue to be able to grow the Canadian economy. With that said, what would the billboard look like to entice companies and people to want to move to Canada to really have a higher chance of success here versus anywhere else they could move, quite frankly?
So, the billboard analogy is one that I've had, some fun with discussing it with others as well. And I think that, when you say come to Canada, a respectful, open country, welcoming to people of diverse natures and diverse backgrounds, where hard work leads to good outcomes. If we eliminate the hard work part of this, I don't think we're heading in the right directions. Where we plan for the future in partnership with our businesses, where we build global champions, where we recognize and support innovation, creativity, and foreign investment and fair competition, right? Fair competition, where true prosperity is achievable and that it is not just a buzzword for an election. That really is, if I was going to say, this is why someone should come to Canada that has got ambitions to build a life for themselves, this is what I hope Canada can be. This certainly was the Canada that my parents came to when they brought us as immigrants to Canada. The view was that this was a land of phenomenal opportunity, and the one driving feature was basically hard work, get a higher education, and make it such that you can be a solid contributor to the economy. And we see all of these people now coming from so many countries who have the ambition to do that. And I think as a country, we should be able to deliver that, but that will take a lot of work from inspired governments going forward.
So just to pick up on that, what do you think needs to change? What needs to pivot here in terms of making sure that this is a land of prosperity that you've enjoyed, that I've enjoyed, to make sure that others can as well? I think that's just so key and critical. Young people having the same opportunities. Where are we on a scale of 1 to 10, in your opinion, and what needs to change?
Yeah. No, look, Canada is a great country. It is a great country, and no government is entitled to hijack it to their own political ambitions. No government is entitled to that. Canada is your Canada, and it's my Canada. It's not some politician's Canada. And I think that is, I understate that, and I underscore that, I should say, and that is critical here, is that it doesn't belong to the politicians. It really doesn't. Just because somebody chooses to run for office, that doesn't give them that entitlement in and of itself. And that's where it comes back to this notion of partnership and having some real dialogue as to what it takes. We are in somewhat of a conundrum. This is a time that is an unsettled time. And I think that we need to have an openness of this kind of dialogue, not just, convenient buzzwords. Of course, one of the things that I was somewhat gobsmacked by is the notion that monetary policy is not important, and interest rates may not be important, and currency conversion may not be important, and attracting foreign investment may not be important, and creating the right kind of jobs may not be important, and the energy sector may not be important. But guess what? At some point, all of that is kind of important if you're talking about building a place that results in prosperity. So, when we look at the transition to a green economy, for sure it needs to be done over a period of time thoughtfully, and it can't stay the way it was. But on the other hand, you have to have an idea that this is affecting lots and lots of lives and lots of people in so many different industries. And so, I think that there has to be somewhat more of an inspired partnership with the people who are experts. Most people who run for office have never run a business. They've never had responsibility for employees, let alone for thousands, tens of thousands of employees. They don't really understand the way the economy functions. In other words, the various pieces that drive the economy. Often they do, count on the bureaucrats to assess those factors for them. But I think that, if we're talking about an inspired, number of years, 10, 15, 20 years coming out of this terrible pandemic, and a little bit of the artificial buoyancy of markets, I think that this does require a different level of inspired partnership.
Absolutely, and we will leave it on that note. Calin, thank you so much for your time and your insights today. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Catherine. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. In case you missed it on your Twitter feed about a week or so ago, it was Prime Minister Trudeau who said he doesn't really think about monetary policy. That is what Calin and I were referring to in the past segment. It matters to everybody. It is the interest rates that you pay on your mortgage, your car, everything. So that's why we brought it up. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.